Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different, and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1: The Mercy Trap. The engine didn't roar its last breath. It just stopped. One moment, sound. The next, silence so thick it felt like drowning in cotton. Gerald let the car glide onto the shoulder, tires crunching over earth the color of rust and forgetting. His wife, Anne, flattened her hand against the dash, like she could feel its heartbeat if she pressed hard enough. Behind them, their daughter sat motionless, eyes locked on the sun as it bled out across the sky. The boy beside her sucked air through his inhaler, each breath a question mark. Gerald counted what was left. 2, maybe 3 uses. That was all. And out here, that meant everything. He cranked the key. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Beyond the glass, the world looked like something half-built and abandoned. Gnarled shrubs, stones dark as bruises and far off. A ridge of mountains that reminded him of broken teeth. No signal. Of course not. The last place they'd seen another human was over an hour back. A woman with kind eyes and a knowing look, like she'd seen this before. Like she knew how it ended. Anne unbuckled. The click echoed. She stepped out into air that tasted like smoke and time, her hair whipping in gusts that carried secrets. Gerald followed, their silhouettes stretching long and skeletal. Then he saw it. East, where night was already gathering, a glow. Not headlights, something softer, older, like lanterns hung between unseen walls. He pointed. Anne stared, her jaw tight, eyes measuring distance and danger. She'd grown up where streetlights outnumbered stars, where fear had a name and a shape. Out here, fear was everything and nothing at once. Gerald unfolded the map, that relic Anne had thrown in the trunk just in case. His finger dragged along the thin black line of highway, searching for a dot, a name, anything. But the paper showed only emptiness and elevation. No town, no refuge, no explanation. Behind them, the boy coughed deep, wet, wrong. 2 pulls left now. Maybe 1. Gerald folded the map. Someone had to choose, him, always him. They would go toward the light. They would take only what mattered: water, the kit, the medicine. Everything else would stay. The bags, the memories packed in cardboard, all of it. The earth shifted as they moved. Grass replaced brush, whispering things they couldn't understand. Then came the junipers, twisted and frozen mid-scream, like the land itself had tried to run and failed. The road bent, the light grew brighter. And with every step, Gerald felt it, the pull of something waiting. The lights appeared when Gerald had almost given up hope. Not one light, several, scattered across the darkening landscape like stars that had fallen and forgotten how to rise. They defined shapes Gerald's exhausted mind struggled to interpret: structures, maybe houses, arranged in a pattern that made no logical sense. Not orderly rows, not a circle, just placed, like someone had dropped them wherever the earth allowed space between the massive stones jutting from the ground. Mira's small hand found his and clamped down hard. The kind of grip that said she understood they'd crossed into somewhere the normal world didn't reach. Behind them, Lucas wheezed, each breath a struggle. Gerald wanted to slow down, but the sun wouldn't wait. The sky was bleeding purple at its edges, that razor-thin moment between daylight and whatever came after, when the desert stopped pretending to be hospitable. The settlement materialized as they topped a low rise. Houses, some traditional, round-walled with doorways facing the sunrise. Others just plain rectangular frames that looked like they'd been standing since the 1950s and had simply refused to collapse. Smoke curled from chimneys. A dog barked once, then went silent as if remembering it shouldn't draw attention. No kids playing outside. No vehicles parked anywhere. The whole place felt like it had pulled itself inward, locked its doors against something. In what passed for the center, just bare earth where several footpaths met, a woman stood waiting. 60, maybe older. Gray hair pulled back tight, face carved deep by years of wind and sun. Jeans, flannel shirt, boots coated in that red dust that seemed to be part of the air itself. Her eyes moved over them with the precision of someone calculating risk. Gerald raised a hand, felt ridiculous doing it, desperate. Anne's fingers tightened around Mira's shoulder. Lucas's breathing rattled behind them. The woman glanced at the horizon, at the sun kissing the edge of the world, and something flickered across her expression that made Gerald's stomach drop. Not quite fear, something worse, acceptance. "Where did you come from?" Her voice was steady, measured. Gerald's explanation tumbled out too fast. The car breaking down, being stranded, needing help. His words betrayed how scared he actually was. She listened without moving, eyes tracking from him to Anne to the kids and back. When he finished, silence stretched between them like a held breath. Then she turned and called toward one of the houses. A man stepped out, younger, maybe 40, same watchful eyes, same way of standing that suggested he was always ready for something. They spoke in a language Gerald didn't know, low voices, but he didn't need translation to understand the tone. This was an argument, a choice neither of them wanted to make. The woman turned back. "I'm May Bali," the woman said. "There's a place you can stay tonight." Relief flooded through Gerald, so fast it made him dizzy. She gestured toward the eastern edge of the settlement. "My brother's cabin, empty now. I'll bring food before the light goes." Gerald was already planning, mourning. They'd figure out transport, get someone to drive them to a town with cell service, get Lucas to a doctor. May's eyes locked onto his. "But there are conditions." Her voice dropped, got heavier, non-negotiable. Gerald nodded quickly. "Of course, whatever you need." "First," she cut him off. "Once the sun sets, you stay inside. Door stays shut until morning. You don't leave, not for any reason." No explanation, no softening, just fact, like warning someone about a minefield. "Second," her voice went even quieter. "No matter what you hear tonight, you stay put. Don't open the door. Don't go near the windows. Don't call out. Don't respond." She repeated it, slower, like she needed them to absorb every word. Anne's nails dug into Gerald's forearm. He wanted to ask why, wanted to demand answers, but something in May's weathered face stopped the question cold. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't small-town superstition meant to spook outsiders. This was a warning from someone who'd seen what happened when people didn't listen. May turned and started walking. They followed. The settlement seemed to wake as they passed. Faces materialized in windows, watching, silent. An elderly man sat motionless on a porch, hands flat on his knees, tracking their movement like he was witnessing a procession toward something final. A younger woman stood framed in a doorway, one hand pressed against the wood, expression carved from stone. No one waved, no one spoke. The whole place held itself perfectly still. The cabin sat separated from everything else by a stretch of bare earth, maybe 50 yards of nothing, small structure, metal roof. Walls made of wood so weathered they'd gone silver. 2 windows facing back toward the settlement, both with heavy shutters. The door had a thick bolt mounted on the inside. May pushed it open. The smell hit first stale air and cedar. A wood stove crouched in the corner with split logs stacked beside it. 2 narrow beds against opposite walls. A table, 2 chairs. A kerosene lamp already burning, throwing weak yellow light across everything. Basic, but clean. Gerald wanted to believe it was safe. "I'll bring food before dark," May said from the doorway. Her outline blocked the dying light. Her eyes found Luca's, watched his chest labor with each breath, and something that looked like grief moved across her face. Then she was gone. Anne was already crouched beside Luca's before the door fully shut, counting his breaths, checking the medication bottle with shaking hands. Mira perched on one of the narrow beds, legs swinging, eyes fixed on the windows where daylight was bleeding into something darker. Gerald grabbed the door bolt, tested it, found it sturdy. The security it offered felt like a lie. May came back 20 minutes later, a woven basket in her arms, flatbread, beans, strips of jerky. She set it down without a word. Outside, the sun had surrendered. Stars were punching through the sky, cold, distant pinpoints in an abyss that seemed to be swallowing everything. May moved to the first window, pulled the shutter closed, latched it from inside. Then the second. The cabin contracted into lamplight and shadows. She looked at each of them in turn, Gerald and the kids. "Whatever you hear tonight," she said slowly, "you don't respond." Then she walked out. Her footsteps faded across the hard-packed earth. Gerald shoved the bolt home, pressed his palm against the door like he could feel danger approaching through the wood. Outside, voices erupted, sharp, urgent, doors banging shut one after another, then nothing. Just silence, thick and waiting. They ate mechanically. The food had no taste. Lucas managed a few bites before his breathing got too rough. Anne eased him into bed, stacked the pillow so he could sit up slightly. Mira climbed into the other bed without being asked, pulled the blanket to her chin. Gerald killed the lamp to conserve fuel. Darkness swallowed everything except thin slivers of starlight bleeding through gaps in the shutters. He sank into a chair. Anne took the other, and they sat in the black, waiting for something neither could name. The first sound came maybe an hour after sunset. Scratching, faint, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. But there were no trees near the cabin, nothing that could reach the walls. It traveled along the western side, slow, deliberate. Every hair on Gerald's neck stood up. Anne's breathing went thin and rapid. Across the room, Mira had frozen completely still. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed in from all sides. Then came something worse. A low, wet sound. A growl that seemed to resonate through the floorboards. Too close. From something massive enough that its breath would steam the windows if they were open. It circled. Gerald tracked it by sound alone. The scrape of claws on dirt. The heavy displacement of air. Whatever it was had weight, had hunger, and had enough intelligence to know exactly where they were hiding. A voice pierced the darkness. High, desperate, speaking words Gerald couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. "Help me." A voice cut through the night. Thin, breaking, a woman's voice, or maybe a child's. It came from the direction of the settlement, calling out in a language Gerald didn't recognize. But he understood it anyway, understood it in his gut. "Help me." Anne's fingers clamped around Gerald's hand in the dark. crushing. Lucas's breathing sped up, shallow and ragged. Mira made a tiny sound before choking it back. The voice moved, circled the cabin, still begging, still pleading in that unfamiliar language that somehow communicated perfect desperation. Then it shifted. English now, or close enough. And it was saying Anne's name, pronouncing it slowly, carefully, like it was savoring each syllable. Anne made a noise deep in her chest, primal, terrified. Then the voice changed again. This time it became Mira's, a flawless replica, terrified and small. "Mommy, Daddy, I got out, please open the door, please, I'm so scared." Anne's breath hitched into something between a sob and a denial, because Mira was right there in the bed across the room, frozen solid, her small body locked rigid with the understanding that something outside had stolen her voice and was wearing it like a costume. The thing using Mira's voice started crying. Authentic, heartbreaking, so real that Gerald's hand moved toward the bolt before conscious thought could intervene. Anne's nails bit into his wrist, drew blood. The crying escalated, desperate, hysterical. "Please, Daddy, please. I'm so scared, it's coming. Please let me in." Then it laughed. Almost human, almost recognizable as joy, but wrong. The duration was wrong. The pitch was wrong. It stretched too long, climbing higher and higher until it became a shriek that vibrated Gerald's teeth in his skull. Then nothing. Silence so absolute Gerald wondered if his eardrums had burst, just ringing in his ears and his heart trying to break through his ribcage. Time dissolved, could have been minutes, could have been hours. Then the screaming started. Somewhere in the settlement, human screaming, wordless, raw, the sound of agony so complete it had incinerated language. It didn't stop. It rose and fell and rose again. Then a second voice joined, then a third, until the night was filled with a chorus of suffering. Gerald was on his feet before he realized he'd moved, hand reaching for the bolt. Anne caught his arm, iron grip dragging him back. They struggled silently, her strength fueled by terror, his by the unbearable need to do something. The screaming cut off. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. In the ringing silence that followed, something massive slammed into the roof. The metal groaned under the weight. Whatever it was started moving, crossing the roof above them. The beams creaked with each step. It stopped directly overhead and began scratching. Slow, rhythmic, patient. Whatever was on the roof wanted inside. Claws, fingers, something dragging across metal. The sound filled the cabin like it was burrowing into Gerald's skull. He pressed his palms over his ears. It didn't help. Lucas started coughing, deep barking. The kind that meant his throat was closing. Anne moved through the darkness toward him, just a shadow among shadows. Found the inhaler, pressed it to his lips, triggered it. Once, twice, the plastic cylinder gave a hollow click. Empty. Gerald's fear changed shape, became something worse than anything outside. Lucas gasped, his small chest heaving, fighting for air that wouldn't come. Anne's hands moved over him frantically, trying to help, but there was no help here. The backup inhaler was in the car, 2 miles away, across ground now occupied by things that stole voices and screamed in the dark. Anne turned toward Gerald. Even in the faint starlight, he could see her face, could see the decision already made. They had to break the rule, had to get to the car, had to choose between 2 kinds of death and pray they chose right. Gerald's hand found the bolt, slid it back. The metallic scrape sounded deafening, like an announcement. He wrapped his fingers around the handle, waited, listening. The roof had gone silent. The settlement beyond was still. He counted to 10, to 20, then pulled the door open. Cold air poured in, smelling of sage and something underneath it, something like copper and freshly dug graves. Gerald stepped out first, let his eyes adjust to the starlight. The settlement's buildings were just dark masses against darker earth. No lights anywhere, no chimney smoke, like the whole place had stopped breathing. He motioned Anne forward. She came, Luca's limp in her arms, Mira clinging to her side. They moved away from the cabin, toward the path that would lead them back to the road, to the car, to the medicine that might save their son. Gerald had taken maybe 10 steps when the first door opened. Not close, farther back, half hidden in shadow. A figure stepped out, moving wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't. Another door opened, then another. Suddenly, the settlement was waking. Shapes emerging from houses into the night they'd locked themselves away from. Gerald froze. His hand shot to Anne's shoulder, pulling her back, pulling all of them back toward the cabin. But he couldn't stop watching. The figures moved into the open ground between structures, 15 of them, maybe 20. Standing in the starlight, Gerald watched their bodies break. The nearest figure, a woman, her spine arched backward, too far, beyond what bone should allow. Her head snapped back and her mouth opened, and what came out was neither scream nor speech, but something in between, a prayer made of agony. Her arms stretched, fingers elongating, bones cracking audibly as new joints formed where none should exist. Her clothing shredded as her frame swelled and warped, ribcage expanding, legs bending the wrong direction at the knees. She collapsed forward onto all fours. Her face began to stretch, jaw unhinging, teeth pushing through gums growing too long, too many. It was happening to all of them. The transformation swept through the settlement like wildfire, bodies convulsing, reforming, humanity peeling away and leaving something else underneath. The sounds were unbearable, not animal howls, not human cries, something caught between the two, pain without any plea for mercy because mercy didn't exist for this. May stood in the center of it all. Gerald recognized her even as her body betrayed her. She was fighting, fists clenched, posture rigid, resisting with everything she had. But her bones cracked anyway. Her spine bowed. Her face began its terrible elongation. She turned her head. Her eyes locked onto Gerald's across the distance. For one heartbeat before the change took her completely, he saw everything in that gaze. Recognition, sorrow, and the knowledge that he'd broken the rule, that he'd witnessed what they'd spent their lives keeping hidden. Then she was gone, replaced by something else, something that threw its head back and howled at the stars with a voice that contained both fury and grief. The creatures that had been the settlement's people began to move. Not toward Gerald's family. Away. Toward the open desert. Toward the wilderness stretching black and endless in every direction. They ran with impossible speed. Bodies built for hunting now, covering ground in massive leaping strides. Their calls echoed for miles across the silent landscape. One broke from the pack, smaller, moving erratically. It crashed through brush, wild and uncontrolled. The others didn't chase it, just kept running, their shapes dissolving into shadows, then into nothing as distance swallowed them whole. Gerald stood paralyzed. Anne beside him, both clutching their children, understanding settling over them like a shroud. The settlement wasn't a refuge. It was a prison. These people didn't lock themselves inside to hide from monsters. They locked themselves in to keep from becoming monsters. The screams Gerald had heard earlier weren't from victims. They were from the transformation itself. The smaller creature that had broken away, the one moving erratically through the brush, that wasn't a victim. It was one of them who'd lost control, someone who couldn't contain what they became anymore, who'd been swallowed by the thing in their blood. May had been trying to protect them, not from outside danger, from this, from witnessing what the settlement carried in their veins, a genetic inheritance, a curse coded into DNA, transforming them every night into something that had to be locked away. And Gerald had violated the one rule that mattered. He'd stepped into their transformation. He'd seen them. Behind them, the cabin door still hung open, yellow lamplight bleeding into the dark. Gerald turned to usher his family back inside. Anne wasn't moving. She was staring toward the settlement, eyes tracking something. Then Gerald saw it too. One creature hadn't run. It stood at the edge of the structures, massive silhouette against the stars, head cocked at an angle no human spine could manage, breath steaming in the freezing air. May. Gerald knew by the way she held herself, some quality of her presence that survived even in this form. She didn't advance, didn't threaten, just watched. And in that stillness lived a question, or maybe a warning. Lucas made a sound, wet, desperate, like drowning on dry land. The spell shattered. Gerald grabbed Anne's arm and hauled her toward the cabin. They stumbled through the doorway, and he slammed it shut, throwing the bolt with hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal. Anne laid Lucas on the bed and started compressions, counting under her breath, training overriding terror. Gerald stood frozen, useless, watching his son's face shift from pale to blue in the lamplight, watching his chest refuse to rise. Mira had wedged herself into the corner, hands clamped over her ears, eyes screwed shut. The cabin filled with Anne's rhythmic counting, with Lucas's absence of breath, with the memory of bodies breaking that would live in Gerald's mind forever. Outside, something scraped against the wall. Slow, deliberate, like carving a message into wood. The sound moved to the door, stopped just beyond the bolt. The door shuddered once, testing, then went still. Anne kept compressing Lucas's chest. Her arms were failing. Gerald could see it in the tremor of her shoulders, but she wouldn't stop. Lucas's lips had darkened from blue to purple. His small hands lay motionless at his sides. The scratching started again. Rhythmic, patient. Whatever stood on the other side was waiting. The settlement had gone silent again, emptied of the creatures that had fled into darkness. Nothing left but the thing standing guard at their door. Gerald lurched toward the table, the basket May had brought. He tore through it with shaking hands, knowing it was pointless but needing to do something because action felt like the opposite of helplessness. His fingers hit fabric at the bottom, wrapped around something solid. He pulled it out. An inhaler, full, new, placed there by May before sunset, before the night claimed her. He thrust it at Anne. She snatched it without breaking rhythm, still compressing, triggered it once, twice, 3 times, forcing medication into lungs that wouldn't respond. She pressed her ear to Lucas's chest, listening for something Gerald couldn't hear. Lucas gasped, tiny, barely audible, but air moving. His chest rose. His lips began fatting from purple back toward something closer to pink. Anne made a broken sound, half sob, half prayer, and crushed him against her. Gerald collapsed into the chair, legs giving out, the inhaler still in his hand, smelling of fresh plastic. May had known. She'd known they might need it, known they might break the rule, and she'd left them this small act of mercy anyway. The scratching had stopped. Gerald held his breath, listening. Nothing outside, no movement, no breathing. The thing that had been May was gone, returned to whatever the creatures did in the dark, running, until exhaustion burned the beast away enough for the human to resurface at dawn. They didn't sleep, just sat in the lamplight watching Lucas breathe, each rise of his chest a small miracle they had no right to witness. Mira eventually folded into sleep in her corner, body surrendering to pure exhaustion. Anne held Lucas and rocked, her lips moving constantly, prayers or curses or numbers. Gerald couldn't tell which. The night stretched forever and ended too fast. Gray light started seeping through the shutter cracks, reluctant, cold. Gerald heard sounds from outside, normal sounds, doors creaking open, someone coughing, footsteps on gravel. He moved to the window, cracked the shutter just enough to see. The settlement looked exactly as it had yesterday. Smoke curling from chimneys, May standing in the square, posture straight, gray hair pulled back, same flannel shirt, same jeans. She looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept, but otherwise unmarked, human completely. Ordinary. Others began appearing from their homes. The elderly man settled into his spot on the porch. The younger woman swept her threshold in slow, methodical strokes. A kid, maybe 12, hauled wood from a stack to one of the round dwellings. They all moved with the careful precision of people performing a ceremony they'd mastered through endless repetition. May's gaze shifted toward the cabin, found Gerald through the distance. In daylight, her eyes were just brown, exhausted, and carrying a sadness so deep it seemed bottomless. She lifted one hand, a small motion that could have meant hello, or goodbye, or stay away. Maybe all three at once. She started walking toward them. Gerald's first impulse was to throw the bolt again, to shield his family from what he now understood she carried inside her. But the door was already locked, and hiding felt shameful in the stark morning light. He waited, palm pressed flat against the wood, until her footsteps stopped just outside. Her voice came through quiet and steady. The southern road leads to Shiprock, about 40 miles. Someone's heading that way in an hour. They'll take you. Your car will get towed to a shop there. No apology, no explanation, just an offer of escape. Gerald's throat tightened. Why did you help us? Why leave the inhaler? Long silence. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of countless transformations endured, of humanity clung to against impossible odds. Your son needed it, she said simply. Some things run deeper than what we carry in our blood. More silence, then her footsteps retreating across packed earth. Gerald cracked the door, watched her return to the square, arms crossed, standing there waiting for whatever the day would bring before the inevitable return of sunset. Anne gathered their things, the emergency kit, water bottles, Lucas wrapped in a blanket, breathing easier now. Mira took Gerald's hand. They stepped out into morning light that felt almost offensively bright, too normal after surviving what they'd survived. A truck idled at the settlement's edge. Old pickup. Navajo man behind the wheel who didn't offer his name, just gestured toward the bed. They climbed in among spare tires and coiled rope. The engine rumbled. The truck pulled away from the settlement, heading south toward Shiprock, toward highways and the world that felt real again. Gerald twisted in the truck bed, watched the settlement shrink behind them, the structures dissolving into the red stone landscape until they became indistinguishable from the earth itself. May stood alone in the square. One final time she raised her hand, that same small, ambiguous gesture. Then she turned away, walked toward the house where she'd spend the day waiting for darkness to claim her again. The sun climbed. The desert spread out in every direction, vast, ancient, keeping its secrets buried deep. Lucas drifted in Anne's arms, his breathing even and steady now. Mira pressed against Gerald's shoulder, eyes shut but not sleeping, still listening for sounds that wouldn't come while the sun was up. Nobody spoke about what they'd witnessed. Words felt either too small or too dangerous, like nomming it out loud might give the transformation some kind of claim over them. But Gerald knew the images would follow them anyway. Bodies shattering, screams that belonged to neither human nor animal, but something caught between. A community that imprisoned itself every night to shield a world that didn't even know it needed shielding. The truck hit a rut. Gerald's hand shot out instinctively, steadying Lucas, palm gentle against the boy's back. He felt the rhythm of breath beneath his touch, that simple, miraculous motion of lungs filling and emptying. And he remembered May's final words. Some things run deeper than what we carry in our blood. He wanted to believe it. But as the settlement vanished behind them into the heat shimmer already rising off the desert floor, Gerald found himself counting hours until sunset. Found himself calculating how far 40 miles really was. Found himself wondering if distance meant anything at all to creatures that could move the way he'd seen them move, covering impossible ground in massive bounds, while the human trapped inside screamed for control they no longer had. Anne's eyes met his across Lucas's sleeping form. He saw his own fear mirrored there. She'd been raised on science, on rational explanations, on the belief that every problem had a solution if you applied enough knowledge and effort. The desert had taught her something different, that some problems could only be survived, some curses only restrained, and some communities stood as the thin line between the world and nightmares the world was fortunate not to comprehend. The truck carried them south, toward safety that felt temporary, toward normal they'd never trust again. Behind them, in a settlement whose name was never spoken, people moved through their day, prepared meals, repaired things that needed fixing, spoke quietly about weather and chores and all the mundane concerns that fill ordinary hours. Nobody mentioned what sunset would bring, because sunset always came, inevitable as heartbeat, and what good were words against that kind of certainty? When the light started dying, May would lock herself inside, would sit alone in the growing dark and feel her skeleton begin its agonizing reconstruction, would resist like she always resisted, knowing she'd fail like she always failed, would burst into the wilderness alongside the others who shared her blood and spend the night running until exhaustion stripped the beast away and dawn dragged her back to human form. And the cabin where Gerald's family survived one impossible night would stand vacant again, waiting for the next travelers unlucky enough to break down on a road most maps didn't bother marking. in territory that remembered when different shapes hunted through darkness, when certain bloodlines paid the cost of survival in their own flesh every time the sun abandoned them. The truck jolted over another rough patch. Lucas stirred, coughed softly, settled back into sleep. Anne's fingers found Gerald's, held tight. Mira opened her eyes, watched the landscape scroll past. Red stone, scrub, empty sky stretching forever. A land indifferent to human terror or human laws or the fragile border between what people were in sunlight and what they became when light failed. Shiprock materialized on the horizon. The distinctive rock formation jutting from desert floor like a vessel stranded in an ocean of red sand. Buildings clustered at its base. The reassuring geometry of civilization returning. Gas stations, motels, chain restaurants, all the ordinary, ugly comfort of roadside America. Something in Gerald's chest finally loosened at the sight. The truck rumbled into a repair shop where their car already waited, delivered through some process Gerald didn't question. The driver gestured toward it without speaking. Gerald understood. This was the end of their passage. Questions wouldn't be answered because questions shouldn't be asked. They moved their belongings from truck to car. Gerald circled the vehicle, checking for damage from the tow. Froze when he reached the driver's door. 4 parallel gouges carved through the metal, starting at the window frame, cutting through paint down to bare steel underneath. Too wide for human fingers. Too deep for any tool he recognized. The torn edges had been forced inward, like something had dragged claws down them. Surface with enough pressure to warp steel. Gerald traced the gouges with his fingertips, feeling their depth. He glanced back at the truck pulling away. The driver's eyes stayed forward. No explanation offered, none expected. Gerald popped the hood. Everything looked fine. He turned the key. The engine caught immediately, purred like it had never failed, like the breakdown had been a fever dream. He sat gripping the wheel, staring at the claw marks reflected in his side mirror. Physical proof, evidence that what they'd seen wasn't exhaustion-induced hallucination or collective madness. Something had stood close enough to touch their vehicle, to mark it, to let them know they'd been witnessed. Anne strapped Lucas into a seat, checked his breathing, counted the remaining doses in the new inhaler. Mira climbed into her spot and buckled herself without prompting. Small hands working the mechanism with the precision of someone who'd learned that survival meant following rules exactly. They merged onto Highway 491, heading south toward Albuquerque, then east toward home. Asphalt cut through red earth in a clean black line. Gerald kept his speed steady, eyes locked on the white stripes marking the boundaries of safe travel. Anne's phone erupted as they passed a cell tower, messages flooding in from the world they'd been severed from. She glanced at the screen, then powered it off, set it face down in her lap. Some things couldn't be compressed into text messages. Some experiences existed outside the vocabulary they shared with people who'd never stood in darkness watching humanity peel away. Desert surrendered to high plains, then mountains, then suburban sprawl where identical houses sat on identical lots and streetlights murdered darkness with their orange glow. Gerald pulled into their driveway as the sun touched the horizon. The garage door opener responded perfectly. Technology, obeying his command like the universe, still followed rules he understood. They carried Lucas inside and tucked him into bed, his small body finally surrendering to sleep that looked like healing. Mira disappeared into her room without a word, door closing with the soft click of someone who needed walls between herself and everything else. Gerald stood at the kitchen window, stared out at the backyard, at the fence dividing their property from the neighbors, at the ordered geometry of suburban existence where everything had its designated place and function. The neighbor's dog barked at something in the gathering dark. Beyond the property line, sharp, brief, then the sound of someone calling it back inside. Anne descended the stairs, stood beside him at the window. Together they watched darkness consume the neighborhood, watched lights blink on in windows across the street, watched the predictable evening choreography unfold around them. Somewhere upstairs, Lucas coughed, a normal sound carrying no alarm. Anne's shoulders sagged with relief. "We can't tell anyone," she said. "Not a question, a declaration." Gerald nodded. Who'd believe us anyway, and what would it accomplish? The settlement existed beyond official recognition, beyond the world's awareness. That wasn't accidental, it was essential. May and her people maintained their isolation not for acknowledgement or praise. They did it because it had to be done. Generation bleeding into generation. Sunset after sunset after sunset. The kitchen clock measured time in steady ticks, seconds accumulating into minutes that would stretch toward hours that would eventually surrender to dawn. Gerald thought of May standing alone in that square right now, waiting for the change, spine bending beyond breaking, bones fracturing and rebuilding themselves, humanity draining away as the beast rose to claim her body. Running through wilderness until exhaustion scorched the curse from her muscles enough for morning to drag her back to human form. "Some things run deeper than what we carry in our blood," she'd said. But she hadn't said the curse could be broken, only survived, only contained. The distinction mattered. Anne's fingers laced through his. Her head came to rest against his shoulder. They stood together as night deepened beyond the glass, as the neighborhood settled into familiar patterns, as their children slept in beds they'd slept in countless times before. Everything was exactly the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. Somewhere northwest, in territory most maps ignored, people were throwing bolts on doors that wouldn't protect them from what lived in their own veins. Were sitting in darkness feeling their skeletons begin their agonizing work, knowing what came next because it always came next, had always come next, would always come next until either the bloodline died out or someone discovered a release that generations of suffering hadn't revealed. Gerald closed the curtains, checked every lock. They performed the rituals of safety, of civilization, maintained their belief in walls and regulations and the fragile barrier separating inside from out. But they both understood how fragile that barrier really was. They'd witnessed it tear, watched humanity drain away and leave something else occupying the space where a person used to be. Lucas coughed again upstairs. Anne went to him. Gerald listened to her footsteps cross the ceiling, heard the door whisper open, heard her voice humming something soft and wordless. He sank into a kitchen chair, left the lights off, watched shadows play across the wall cast by streetlights filtering through windows. Ordinary, explicable, nothing threatening. The coat rack's shadow fell across the far wall in its familiar shape. Then for one impossible second it stretched, one limb extending unnaturally toward the room's center, reaching, then snapping back to normal. Not the gradual shift of changing light, not the slow drift of clouds overhead. Deliberate extension, deliberate retraction. like something testing how far it could go. Gerald stood abruptly, slapped the light switch. Fluorescent glare flooded the kitchen. Shadows evaporated under electricity's ordinary magic. He told himself it was exhaustion, trauma, his mind still processing what he'd seen in a place that officially didn't exist. But he remained standing there, staring at that wall, knowing some doors, once opened, couldn't be fully sealed again. That distance meant less than he desperately wanted to believe. That the membrane separating what people were in sunlight from what they became when darkness claimed them was thinner than walls, thinner than locks, thinner than all the miles they'd driven to escape a quarantine designed to shield a world that didn't even know it needed shielding. Story 2, the house that chose its owner. The house was waiting long before Cale arrived, and somehow, deep in the marrow of his bones, he already knew that. He just didn't know what it was waiting for. It rose like a monument to forgetting, 3 floors of crumbling elegance, perched at the end of a street that had no reason to exist anymore. Foundry Street. Even the name sounded like a grave. The last streetlight had died years ago, its bulb shattered or stolen, leaving only darkness and the skeletal arms of winter trees. Snow drifted down in silence, not the kind that makes you think of warmth or Christmas. This was the snow that buries things, slowly, permanently. Cale stopped at the gate, iron, old, rust blooming across its surface like dried blood. He pushed. It swung open without a sound. That should have been impossible. Metal that old, that corroded, it should have screamed, should have fought him, but it didn't. It welcomed him, like it had been oiled just that morning, like someone knew he was coming. His breath misted in the air, and for a moment he considered turning back. But where would he go? He'd been in this town for 3 days now. 3 days of searching for answers that didn't want to be found. 3 days since the call, the one that started with, "We regret to inform you," and ended with an address he'd never heard of and a name he didn't recognize. An inheritance from someone he'd never met. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped through the gate. Behind him, it swung shut, softly, deliberately. He didn't look back. The house loomed closer now, its windows black and hollow, watching him with the patience of something that had waited decades and could wait decades more. Paint peeled from the walls like skin. The porch sagged under the weight of time. And yet, there was something alive about it. Something that pulsed beneath the rot. Cale climbed the steps, each one grown but held. At the top, a door, solid oak, a tarnished brass knocker shaped like a clenched fist. He reached for the handle. It turned before he touched it. The door opened, and from inside he heard it, faint, impossibly faint, the sound of someone breathing. The town had a name once. Cale was sure of it, but now it felt like a place that had simply stopped. Mills gone silent, church doors locked against ghosts no one feared anymore. 6 days ago, the diner 3 blocks back had still been open. He'd eaten there, eggs and burnt coffee. Now, boarded up, dark, like it had never existed at all. His boots pressed into fresh snow, each step swallowed by silence so complete it felt intentional. An old woman at the laundromat, one of the last souls still clinging to this dying place, had seen him staring at the house through the fogged glass. She'd leaned close, her voice low and worn. "That place," she'd said. "The matriarch lives there, never leaves, never talks. Her husband made a fortune in the mines, they say. Hid it all inside before she paused, before he ended it, walked into the smelter himself. But her eyes, they'd been empty. like she was reading from a script she'd memorized long ago and had stopped caring about. Cale hadn't cared either, not really, because he was starving. Not just hungry, starving. The kind that makes your vision blur, that turns the world into a narrow tunnel where only one thing matters: survival. And at the end of that tunnel stood this house, waiting. He didn't believe in destiny. He believed in opportunity, in action, in the crowbar tucked inside his coat, $17 at a pawn shop that looked shocked to still have customers. He climbed the porch steps. They didn't creak. That was wrong. Old wood always creaks, always betrays you. But these steps, silent, like they'd been expecting him, like they'd made a choice not to give him away. The door was ancient, the lock even older. He wedged the crowbar into the gap, applied pressure. And it gave, barely a sound, just a soft click, like the house had been holding its breath and finally let go. He stepped inside. The air hit him first, cold but not frozen, empty but not dead. It had a presence. The hallway stretched ahead, longer than it should have been. He'd seen the house from outside. It wasn't this deep. But here he was, staring down a corridor lined with doors. He counted them as he moved. 7 on one side, 6 on the other. His flashlight swept the walls. Wallpaper, floral pattern. Or no, wait. He stopped. Not flowers. Faces. Small, delicate, woven into the design like they'd always been there. And the longer he stared, the more certain he became they were watching him. He tore his gaze away, focused on the floor instead. Bare wood, painted brown, dark brown, the kind of brown that made you think of things you didn't want to think about. And not a speck of dust. That was wrong too. Houses like this, they drown in dust. Time buries everything, but this floor, it gleamed, polished, cared for. Like someone had just cleaned it. Like someone was still living here. The wood beneath his feet didn't just look clean, it shone. Like invisible hands had been polishing it for years, obsessively, endlessly. Cale stopped at the third door on the right. Something was wrong. The lock wasn't on his side. It was facing out. This door wasn't meant to keep people from getting in. It was meant to keep something from getting out. He touched the cold metal. Instantly, his fingertips went numb, not from temperature, but from something deeper, something that felt like it came from beyond the metal itself. The keyhole stared back at him, empty, dead. He kept moving. Door after door, lock after lock, all facing him. 11 rooms, 11 cells. This wasn't a home. It was a prison. He should have left, should have turned around, walked out into the snow, into the honest cold of a winter night that made sense. But his legs didn't stop. They carried him forward like he was a piece on a board, moved by hands he couldn't see, playing a game he'd never agreed to. The hallway ended at a staircase. His flashlight couldn't penetrate the darkness above. It was too thick, too solid, like the shadows themselves had weight. To his left, another corridor leading deeper into the belly of the house. To his right, a door, no lock, but underneath it something seeped out, a smell. Rot. Not fresh, not sudden. This was slow rot. The kind that happens when something once alive begins the patient work of becoming something else. His hand moved before his mind caught up. He gripped the doorknob, brass, green with age. It turned before he touched it, like it had been waiting for him. The door swung open on its own. His flashlight swept the room. A kitchen, frozen in time. green appliances, faded linoleum with patterns that made his eyes hurt, a table set for one, plate, cup, single fork, arranged not like a meal but like a ceremony. On the counter, 3 glass jars stood in a row, descending in size. The largest filled with water, crystal clear. The middle cloudy, something floating inside, layers forming, separating. The smallest thick, dark, almost black, and inside it something moved, slow, deliberate, like it was being heated from within. Though the room was freezing. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew these were stages, samples, a timeline of decay. Someone had been documenting what happens when life stops, when flesh forgets what it was. He stepped closer to the sink. His reflection stared back at him from the window above it. His face looked gray, exhausted, unshaven, eyes that had stopped hoping for anything better somewhere around his second time behind bars. But in the reflection, he saw something else. Behind him, in the doorway, a figure. He spun around, flashlight slashing through the dark. Nothing. The doorway was empty. His heart, which had been steady, trained by years of breaking into places he shouldn't, suddenly slammed into his throat. He looked back at the window. The figure was still there, in the reflection. A woman, maybe tall, impossibly thin. Her spine bent at angles that bones weren't meant to bend. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She just stood there, existing in the glass but not in the room. The smell hit him harder now. Not rot. Something worse. Like something was being unmade. Like the universe was forgetting how to hold it together. His nose started to itch, then burn. He touched his upper lip. Blood. Behind him, not in the reflection this time, but in the real world, something cracked. Loud, sharp, like old wood splitting under weight. He turned. Still nothing. Just the jars, the table, the appliances humming their ancient hum. Crack, crack, crack. A rhythm, footsteps. But not human footsteps. Something learning to walk. Something remembering how joints worked, how limbs moved. Every instinct Cale had, every survival reflex beaten into him by foster homes, fistfights, and cold jail cells, screamed at him to move. He bolted toward the hallway, toward the front door, toward escape. The cracking sound followed, matching his pace. And now from somewhere above, a scraping, like nails on wood, huge nails, dragged slow and deliberate. His flashlight swung toward the staircase. At the top, where the darkness should have been absolute, 2 lights, dull, gleaming like old pennies, too far apart to be eyes, unless the skull between them had been stretched. They blinked, disappeared, and when they opened again, they were 4 steps closer. No movement, no sound, just closer. Cale ran. Not toward the front door. That meant passing the stairs. He ran deeper, into the passage he hadn't explored, into rooms he hadn't seen, into places he was about to see whether he wanted to or not. His flashlight beam jerked wild across the walls, wallpaper twisting into patterns that shouldn't exist, that hurt to look at, patterns that moved when he wasn't looking directly at them. A door on his left hung open. He threw himself through it. A bedroom, or what was left of one. Time had crushed it into layers, decades stacked on top of each other like sediment. A bed frame, no mattress. A dresser, no drawers. A mirror on the wall. No reflection. Not of him, not of the room, just black, deep, endless, like staring into a hole in reality. The temperature dropped. Vast. His breath turned to fog so thick he could barely see through it. And in that fog, he heard it. The scraping. Behind him. To his left. Above him. Though there was no opening in the ceiling. The mirror started to change. The black faded, lightened, like something on the other side was pressing against the glass, pushing through. And then he saw it. The same room, his room, but in the mirror. A figure on the bed. A woman. Ancient, skin like old paper. Bones jutting beneath a white gown that looked like it belonged in a coffin. Her eyes, those dull gleaming coins, locked onto him. And she smiled. Teeth, too many, too long. Rows of them descending back into her throat like the inside of a shark. The glass rippled. Like water. Cale stumbled back. And fell through the wall. It wasn't there anymore. He dropped. Hit stairs. Hard, tumbling, rolling. Down, down, down into darkness that swallowed him whole. His flashlight flew from his hand, its beam spinning wild. Stone walls slick with water, a floor cluttered with things. A chair, leather straps. A table, metal instruments. Jars bigger than the ones upstairs, filled with cloudy liquid, and inside them. He didn't want to know. He hit the bottom. Pain exploded through his ribs, his shoulder, his knee. His teeth caught his tongue. Blood filled his mouth. The flashlight went dark. Total blackness. The kind that feels heavy, that presses down on your eyes like hands. He lay still, gasping, heart hammering so loud he thought it would burst. Above him, from the top of the stairs. Crack, crack, crack. Descending. Each crack, a joint bending. Bones grinding in sockets worn smooth by centuries of use. Between the cracks, he heard breathing. Not human breathing, not panicked or tired. This was mechanical, in and out, perfectly timed like a machine. Light bloomed at the top of the stairs. Not from a flashlight, not from anywhere. It just existed. A glow that made the darkness feel worse because now he could see into it. And she descended. The woman. But she didn't walk. She flowed. Her limbs bent at angles that didn't exist in the human body. Joints where there shouldn't be joints. Her head rotated, all the way around like an owl, while her body kept moving downward. Her gown hung off her like a shroud, like she'd crawled out of a grave and forgotten to die. Cale scrambled backward, hands slapping the floor, grabbing things he didn't want to touch. Smooth things, curved things, things that felt like bone. His back hit metal. The furnace, ancient, cold, covered in rust. She reached the bottom. She stood, and she looked at him. Her eyes no whites, just pupils, massive, filling the entire socket, gleaming like tarnished metal. Her mouth opened. No sound came out, but he felt it. A pressure deep below hearing. It vibrated in his teeth, his sinuses, his skull. Blood poured from his nose, hot, thick. And with it came something worse. A feeling from inside him. Like his body was receiving instructions from something that wasn't him. She stepped forward. Her foot bare, impossibly long, toes with too many joints touched the floor. Frost spread where she stepped, despite the warmth still lingering in the room. Another step. Crack. Another. Crack. Bones bending in ways that should have shattered them. Cale's hand found something. Metal heavy, a pipe 3 feet long. He gripped it with both hands. She reached for him, fingers stretching, extending like they had no end, like they could just keep growing. He swung. The pipe connected with her skull. The sound wasn't right. It should have crushed bone, should have echoed with wet impact. Instead, it sounded like hitting a hollow tree. Her head snapped to the side, all the way, farther than any spine could bend without breaking. She paused. Her head rotated back, smooth, slow, deliberate. Her mouth split wider, wider, like a snake unhinging its jaw. The sound that came out wasn't a scream. It was worse. A frequency, something his ears couldn't process but his body could. His vision went white at the edges. Pain detonated behind his eyes. He swung the pipe again, and again, and again. Each time that same hollow thunk. Each time nothing. Her hand shot out. It closed around his wrist. Her grip was cold, dry, like old leather left baking in the sun. She pulled, not with muscle, with something deeper, something impossible. Her face came close, too close. Her skin wasn't skin. It was parchment, stretched over a frame that moved all wrong. Her eyes held nothing, no thought, no emotion, just the cold function of a machine performing its task. Her breath washed over him. That smell, the one from upstairs. The smell of things unmaking, of time running backward, of matter forgetting what it was supposed to be. Cale let go of the pipe. He twisted, hard, desperation lending him strength he didn't know he had. Her grip broke. He scrambled away on hands and knees. No direction, no plan, just away. His hand landed on something. Glass. It shattered. Liquid spread across the floor, and in it, shapes, organs, embryos, things caught halfway between alive and not. He looked up. She wasn't following. She stood in the center of the basement, head tilted, like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she turned, and she walked, flowed back toward the stairs. At the third step, she stopped. She looked back, and in that look, Cale understood. Not malice, something worse. Purpose. He was supposed to be here. Had always been supposed to be here. Every bad choice, every failure, every desperate moment that led him to this town, this house, this basement. It wasn't random. It was inevitable. She continued up the stairs and disappeared. Cale was alone, surrounded by broken jars, impossible cold, and the growing certainty that he hadn't broken into this house at all. The house had swallowed him. The only question now was how long it would take to digest him. He crawled across the floor, hands padding through debris he refused to look at. Finally, his flashlight. Cracked lens, but it still worked. He flicked it on and took inventory of his cage. The stairs led up to a door, locked from the other side. No windows. 3 walls stone, 1 concrete block. The floor cracked cement, stained with patterns that could have been water damage. Or blood. In the corner farthest from the stairs, he found something. A coal chute. A narrow metal slot built into the foundation, maybe 18 inches wide, angled upward toward what he hoped was ground level. A metal plate covered the opening, bolted from the outside. But the bolts, rusted, weak, decades of decay eating through them. He examined them with his flashlight. They looked ready to break. He grabbed the pipe from the floor, ignoring the dark stains coating it, and wedged the threaded end into the gap between the plate and the stone. He pulled. The plate groaned. He pulled harder. The bolt screamed, resisting, then slowly giving. Above him, the house came alive. The cracking sound started again, moving across the ground floor, then up to the second story. Then, impossibly, across the ceiling directly above him. Like she'd learned to walk on walls, on ceilings, like gravity didn't matter anymore. The sound circled him. Hunting. The plate tore free with a metallic shriek. Cale yanked it away and stared into the chute. Darkness, cold air, the smell of snow. And something else. Something stale, like a tomb that hadn't been opened in years. He aimed his flashlight up the shaft. 8 feet above, a hinged door set into the foundation at ground level. He could fit. Barely. If he went head first, arms out, pushing with his feet. If he could reach that door. If it opened outward. If it wasn't locked like every other exit in this place. If it was locked, he'd be trapped, wedged in the chute, unable to move forward, unable to go back. Stuck, until something came to collect him. The cracking sound descended the stairs. She was coming back. Cale pulled himself into the chute. Metal pressed against his shoulders. Rust and cold dust filled his lungs. He pushed with his feet. 6 inches. He pushed again. Above the door, a thin line of gray light around its edges. Dawn, or just the dying glow of the last streetlight. He didn't care. He pushed harder. Metal scraped his ribs. His bruised body screamed in protest. Behind him, at the opening of the chute. Breathing. Mechanical. Precise. She'd found him. He heard her at the bottom of the chute, that steady, mechanical breathing, and something inside him broke. He shoved upward with everything left. His hands found the door's edge, pulled. It didn't move. He pulled again, harder, muscles tearing, lungs burning. The door exploded open. Cold air slammed into him like a fist. Snow spiraled through the opening, kissing his face with freezing needles. He dragged himself out, tumbling onto frozen earth, gasping, blood pouring from his nose and mouth, coat torn to ribbons, hands too numb to feel. He rolled away from the opening and looked up. The house towered above him, 3 stories of rotting elegance carved black against a sky thick with clouds. From the chute, a sound, not the cracking of bones this time. Something worse, like fabric ripping, like a cocoon splitting open, like something emerging. He didn't look back. He ran, snow deep enough to swallow his knees. He fought through it, stumbling, clawing his way toward the street, toward the dead lamp, toward anything that felt real. His chest burned. Every breath felt like swallowing glass. The cold should have killed him. His coat was shredded, his skin exposed. But instead he felt hot, feverish, like his body was trying to cook itself from the inside out. Like his skin was too tight, like his bones were trying to push through. He reached the gate. It stood open. He'd closed it. He knew he'd closed it. But now it hung wide, welcoming, like it had been waiting for him to return. He burst onto Foundry Street. No tire tracks, no footprints. Just untouched snow stretching in both directions, swallowing the abandoned buildings on either side. He turned left, toward what he thought was the center of town, and ran past houses that looked less like homes and more like shells. Empty husks no one had lived in for years. Maybe decades. His were the only footprints. No one had walked here. No one had been here. 2 blocks from the mansion, his legs gave out. Not all at once, just slowly, like they were forgetting how to run. Like his body was acting out a script it had already memorized. And then the thought hit him. I've felt this before. Not here, not tonight. But this feeling, this texture of inevitability. He'd felt it his whole life. Every desperate choice, every bad decision, every moment that led him here. They'd all felt like this. Like he wasn't making choices. Like he was remembering them. Like the ending had already been written, and he was just walking through the motions toward a conclusion that had always been waiting. His knees hit the snow, and for the first time, Cale understood. He'd never been running toward anything. He'd been running to this. Always. At the corner where Foundry met Maine, he stopped. The diner. The one where he'd eaten 6 days ago. But it wasn't boarded up anymore. The windows were dark, yes, but not covered. He could see through them. Tables still dressed. Menus still propped upright. Salt and pepper shakers arranged in perfect rows. Like it was waiting for morning. Like customers would walk in any minute. But no one would. He knew that now. Through the glass, something moved. A figure skeletal, sitting in a booth. He looked directly at it. Gone. He looked away, used the corner of his vision. There, sitting, watching. And that's when it clicked. The loop. He'd done this before. Not literally. Not this street, this town, this night. But the pattern. Every city he drifted through. Every job that fell apart. Every chance that evaporated the moment he reached for it. This was just the same story. Bigger props, different stage. Same ending. He wanted to scream. Wanted to curse himself for being so stupid. For letting hunger drive him into that house. For every rotten choice that led him here. For the entire worthless sequence of failures that made up his life. But when he opened his mouth, the sound that came out wasn't human. It was wet, clicking, mechanical. Empty. He stumbled forward down Main Street. This should lead to the highway, to escape, to gas stations that were closed for normal reasons and diners that went under because of economics, not because reality was eating itself. But Main Street curved, bent back, and 6 blocks later, he was standing at the same intersection. Foundry and Main. Same church, same station, same diner. Same figure in the booth. He'd walked this before. Not once. Dozens of times. Maybe hundreds. The memory didn't exist, but the feeling did. Deja vu so strong it became certainty. The fever under his skin intensified. His coat, which had fit when he broke into the house, now hung loose, like his body had shrunk inside it. He held up his hands in the diner's pale light. The skin was wrong. Looser, sagging, pulling away from bone. His veins bulged like roots breaking through soil, dark, pronounced, mapping paths across his hands he'd never seen before. Behind him, from the direction of the mansion, though he'd run the opposite way. Crack, crack, crack. Approaching steady, unhurried. Certain. He turned, and she was there. The woman, the matriarch, walking toward him through the snow. The woman, the one the laundromat owner had called the matriarch, stood at the intersection he'd just fled. Center of the street. Snow falling through her body instead of on it. Her eyes locked onto him from across the distance. Clicking, like a trap snapping shut. She started walking toward him. Not flowing this time, not gliding. Walking, like she decided to imitate how humans move, for her own amusement, or for something worse. Each step brought her closer. And with each step, the fever inside Cale climbed higher. His skin pulled tighter. Something deep in his body, his cells, his bones, his blood, began rearranging itself. Following instructions he didn't understand. Instructions he couldn't disobey. He ran. Off Main Street, down a side road between buildings he'd never seen before, despite wandering this town for 6 days. These buildings had no features, no signs, no detail. Just walls, brick or wood, windows that showed nothing when he looked through them. The road grew narrower. The walls leaned in, like a throat, and he was being swallowed. The road ended at a building he did recognize. The laundromat. Light glowed in the window, warms yellow. Inside, the old woman, the one who'd warned him. She stood at a folding table, folding towels over and over, each one receiving the same folds, the same placement, the same stack. A ritual repeated so many times it had lost all meaning. She was just going through the motions, because the motions were all she had left. Cale shoved through the door. A bell chimed. The sound was wrong. Not metal on metal. Flesh on brass. The old woman didn't look up. He stumbled toward her, vision pulsing with his heartbeat, fever turning the world into a throbbing blur. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her about the mansion, about the woman hunting him, about everything. But the words came out wrong. Backwards, scrambled, syllables eating each other until they meant nothing. The old woman kept folding. On the TV in the corner, a silent program played. People sitting in a living room, laughing, mouths opening and closing without sound. Like puppets. Cale reached out, tried to grab her arm, to shake her, to make her see him. His hand passed straight through her shoulder, like she was made of smoke. She flickered just for a second, a glitch in reality, then solidified, still folding, never stopping. The bell chimed again. Cale turned. The matriarch stood in the doorway. Snow fell through her nightgown, through her body. She stood in the doorway, her frame too large for the space, yet somehow fitting through a geometry that shouldn't exist. She stepped inside. Her bare feet left no prints on the tile. The old woman didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her, just kept folding. The matriarch stopped 3 feet from Cale and opened her mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a scream. It was a frequency, a sustained note that vibrated in his teeth, his sinuses, his eye sockets. Blood exploded from his nose. His ears screamed with a ringing that drowned out everything else. And beneath the frequency, carried inside it like a message encoded in static, came understanding. Not words, not language. Just pure comprehension, injected directly into his brain. This had always been his purpose. Every choice he'd ever made, every failure that led to the next, every desperate grab at something better that closed around empty air. All of it. Preparation. The town wasn't real, not in any way that mattered. The people weren't real. They were props, background actors, stage dressing for a performance that only had two real participants. Him and this, the thing standing in front of him. It wasn't a woman, had never been a woman. It was just using her, like a hermit crab uses a discarded shell, temporary housing for something that needed a container but had no loyalty to any particular shape. And the shell was failing. The woman's body had degraded, rotted, broken down beyond repair. And Cale, by entering the house, by breathing the air, by struggling, had agreed to serve as the replacement. He wanted to run. His legs wouldn't move. He wanted to scream. His throat had sealed shut. He could only stand there and receive. The frequency poured into him, reorganizing the spaces between his cells, rewriting him from the inside out. And he felt it time, not as something that passed, as something with weight, with substance, with mass, flowing into him from the woman, from the house, from the town that existed only to feed the house. The matriarch raised her hand. Her fingers, impossibly long, touched his forehead. Gentle, a mockery of gentleness. Where her fingers touched, his skin went cold, then numb, then loose, like it had been glued to his skull, and the glue had failed. His vision dimmed. The edges of his vision went black. The laundromat, the old woman, the silent TV. All of it receding down a tunnel. And at the end of that tunnel, only her face. The matriarch's face. Changing. The flesh losing shape. Melting. Revealing something underneath that had no face at all. Just purpose. His knees gave out. He hit the floor, but it didn't feel like floor. It felt soft, yielding, like he'd landed on the surface of something liquid, held together only by tension. His hand splayed in front of him. Wrong. The skin gray now, loose, hanging off the bone, veins bulging beneath like cables under thin parchment. He tried to make a fist. It took seconds, his tendons crawling into place like glaciers. Above him, the matriarch straightened. The frequency stopped, and in the silence, Cale heard his own breathing. But it wasn't his anymore. It was mechanical, perfectly timed, in, out, in, out. He wasn't breathing. He was being breathed. Something had decided his lungs should keep working, not because he needed them, but because function was all that mattered. Movement for the sake of movement, existence for the sake of existence. The matriarch turned, walked out. The bell chimed. The old woman kept folding, never looked up, never acknowledged what had just happened 3 feet from her, never stopped her meaningless work. Cale stayed on the floor, watching his hands continue their transformation, watching the skin sag and gray and rot while still moving. Time, he'd always thought of it as something abstract, something that just passed. But now he understood. Time had appetite. The entity fed on it, metabolized it, burned it like fuel in the furnace of the matriarch's body. And now that furnace was empty. He tried to stand. His body didn't respond. Not the way it used to. He had to think about it now, break it into steps. Shift weight to palms, bend knees, lift torso. Each movement required conscious thought, deliberate planning, execution. Nothing was automatic anymore. He was piloting his body from outside it, like sitting in a control room, operating machinery he'd never been trained to use. By the time he finally stood, the old woman had finished her stack and started over, unfolding the same towels, refolding them, same motions, same order. Again and again and again. On the TV, a new show played, a game show. Contestants guessing prices, an audience clapping in perfect, soundless applause. Cale turned toward the door and took his first step. He walked to the door. Every step was a puzzle, a calculation, like learning to walk for the first time. He pushed through. Cold air hit him. It felt like fire. His senses had inverted. Hot was cold. Cold was hot. His body was forgetting what things were supposed to feel like. The street outside was empty. The matriarch gone. But not gone. He could feel her, spreading out, dissolving into the spaces between things, waiting for him to finish becoming whatever he was becoming, so she could finally let go. He walked. His reflection passed across darkened shop windows. He didn't recognize the figure staring back. Hunched, skeletal, moving like a puppet on strings. The fever had broken, but what replaced it was worse. Cold from inside him, radiating outward through his bones, his blood, his skin. His clothes hung loose now. His body had shrunk inside them. His hands covered in liver spots that hadn't been there an hour ago. His face glimpsed in a pharmacy window sunken, eyes receding into hollows carved too deep, skin thin and papery. Just like hers. At the intersection where Main Street should have led to the highway. A different road. One he'd never seen before. Narrow, descending between buildings into a district where the structures had no doors, no signs, just smooth walls and blind windows. He followed it, because following was all he had left. Choice had been taken from him, along with everything else. The town was a maze with only one path. No matter which way you turned, you ended up in the same place. The lane ended at a motel. Single story, 12 units arranged in an L around a parking lot. One vehicle sat in the lot. A police cruiser, lights off, engine running, exhaust vapor rising into the frozen air like breath. The motel sign blinked vacancy in red letters, not flickering like a broken bulb. Poolsing, like it was trying to say something, in a language Cale didn't know yet. He approached the cruiser. Through the window, an officer in the driver's seat, maybe 40, face hollow with exhaustion, like he'd been working the same shift for decades. The officer didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on something through the windshield, something Cale couldn't see. Cale knocked on the passenger window. The sound was wrong. Soft, muffled, like the glass was padded from the inside. The officer turned his head, slow, deliberate, and gestured for Cale to get in. Cale opened the door. The interior smelled like stale coffee and synthetic pine, an air freshener dangling from the mirror, trying and failing to mask something underneath. Something rotten. The decay had already begun when he dropped into the passenger seat. Cale knew it the instant the door shut. The belt moved before he could touch it, alive, purposeful, sliding over his chest and snapping tight with the sound of something sealed forever. A second later, the doors locked, a dull, final clack that felt less mechanical and more like earth settling over a coffin. The officer didn't react. He didn't glance over. He didn't speak. He sat perfectly upright, hands fixed on the wheel, engine humming patiently as if the car were waiting for time itself to catch up. Outside, nothing moved. KL looked up at the rearview mirror. The face staring back wasn't his anymore. In the span of minutes, decades had collapsed into him. His skin sagged in loose, lifeless folds, stained and colorless, as if blood had long since given up on it. Strands of hair detached from his scalp and drifted down onto his jacket, light and dry like soot after a fire. His eyes, his eyes were no longer eyes at all, just cloudy orbs filmed over with a milky haze that spoke not of blindness, but of years stacked upon years, layered until nothing clear remained. He lowered his gaze to his hands. His fingers were swollen, twisted, bent into shapes that pain alone couldn't explain. Joints bulged unnaturally, skin stretched thin over them, ancient and wrong. His breath caught, a scream tried to rise. It never made it past his chest. "You're ready." 2 words, flat, certain. The officer finally turned his head just enough to confirm what he already knew. KL shook, opening his mouth to argue, to beg. He wasn't ready. This couldn't be happening. He needed help, a hospital, answers. He needed someone to explain what that woman in the house had done to him, why the walls had breathed, why the clocks had all been stopped at different hours. But no language came out. What escaped his throat was a sound, a thin, piercing note that lingered unnaturally in the air, rattling the windows, making the officer flinch for the first time. It wasn't speech, it was resonance. And in that vibration, clarity arrived. Too late. The woman hadn't tried to kill him. She hadn't been guarding anything. She hadn't been attacking at all. She had been emptying herself. Whatever lived inside her, whatever fed on the slow erosion of years, could not exist alone. It needed meat, nerves, bone, a living anchor to keep it bound to this side of reality, and no body could hold it forever. Time burned through flesh the way current burned through wire, weakening it until replacement became necessary. She hadn't been a monster. She had been a vessel looking for relief. The house suddenly made sense. The locks that sealed from the inside, the narrow halls, the false exits, the way every delay seemed intentional. It wasn't built to keep her trapped. It was built to keep others from leaving too soon, to stall them just long enough for the transfer to finish. Even the town wasn't real in the way he'd believed. It existed to soften the edges, to disguise the wrongness at the center. A stage set, a buffer, a lie big enough to make the impossible feel ordinary. And KL, starving, tired, convinced he'd just stumbled into a strange but harmless place, had been perfect. The officer faced forward again. The car finally shifted into gear. KL felt the weight inside him settle, vast and patient, stretching into its new home. The engine pulled them down the road. Time at last had somewhere new to live. He finally understood the cruel elegance of it. Every choice he thought he'd made, every lock he'd forced, every hallway he'd fled down in blind panic had been pre-written. The town hadn't hunted him, it had guided him. He had arrived at the house at the exact instant the former bearer could no longer endure what lived inside her. His resistance, his terror, his belief that he had escaped on his own terms, those weren't failures in the system. They were the system. Each door that slammed shut had been an invitation. Each snare a calibration. Fear had softened him, hollowed him, made space. By the time he staggered free, the burden had already found its place. He would carry it now just as she had, until his body wore thin enough to require another. The cycle never broke. It only changed hands. The officer leaned across him and pushed the door open. The belt slid away as if it had never been there. Cold air rushed in. Across the lot, a motel stood waiting, its vacancy sign buzzing and blinking like a tired eye refusing to close. One door glowed brighter than the rest. Room 7. Open. Ready. KL didn't need to be told. That room wasn't shelter. It was assignment. It was where he would remain, watching, waiting, holding, until the thing inside him finished eroding what was left of his usefulness, until another lost soul drifted close enough to be chosen. He stepped out of the cruiser. His body protested every movement. Joints cracked and popped, announcing themselves with the same brittle music he'd heard echoing behind him in the mansion halls. Walking required focus now. Muscles obeyed reluctantly, as though they belonged to someone else. Snow fell around him and through him, passing with a strange indifference, as if he were already less solid than the world it touched. With each step he felt himself thinning, not dying, emptying, becoming structure instead of person. At the door to room 7, he stopped and looked back. The cruiser was gone. The lot lay silent and bare except for his footprints, already filling with snow far too quickly. Either the storm was lying about its strength, or time itself had begun to slide when he wasn't looking. Soon there would be nothing left to suggest he had ever walked here as a man with a past, with intentions of his own. He went inside. The room was simple: a bed, a chair, a television murmuring light without sound. On the screen, the same game show played, the same smiling contestants, the same clapping crowd, mouths moving in perfect silence. The chair was positioned by the window, facing the road beyond the lot. He sat. The chair yielded easily, accepting what little weight he still carried. Outside, the road stretched on, patient. Whether it would be days or years before someone arrived no longer mattered. Time had lost its shape. All that remained was certainty. Someone would come. Someone tired. Someone starving. Someone sure they were acting of their own free will. And when they did, KL would be ready. Opportunity would come wearing a familiar disguise. A blinking light. A promise of shelter. Someone would notice the empty rooms, feel luck brush against them, and step inside believing they had made a smart choice. When that moment arrived, Kale would stand from the chair, joints popping like dry branches snapping underfoot, and he would do what had been done to him. He hated that he already knew this. He fought it at first, in small, quiet ways. He tried to imagine speaking the truth, warning the next traveler, breaking the chain at its weakest link. He pictured himself resisting at the final second, refusing, collapsing, choosing anything other than obedience. But the thought never finished forming. Something inside him rewrote it mid-breath, smoothing rebellion into compliance. The thing he carried didn't argue, it didn't threaten, it simply adjusted him. Time burned inside his body now, fed into an invisible engine that used his nerves and marrow as fuel. Choice dissolved under that pressure. Resistance wasn't punished, it was removed, the way unnecessary parts are stripped from a machine. A sound crawled out of his throat without permission. Long, pure, wrong. The windows trembled. The screen across the room distorted, ripples crawling beneath its mute images. The air itself seemed to hesitate. Outside in the lot, something shimmered. Not a person, not quite emptiness either, more like a placeholder, an outline waiting to be filled when the rotation came back around. Roles exchanged, bodies replaced, the same positions occupied again and again long after the town had learned how to pretend it was new. Kale looked down at his hands. They were changing. Skin tightened, stretched thin across bones that subtly elongated, fingers separating into unfamiliar proportions. The transformation wasn't violent, it was efficient. His spine followed, curving incrementally, vertebrae settling into angles designed for movements no human body should need. He recognized the shape he was becoming because he had chased it once, terrified, through dark corridors. This wasn't decay, it was conversion. He wasn't being ruined, he was being optimized. How long the woman before him had endured this role was unknowable. Years meant nothing here, neither did decades. Time no longer marched forward, it pooled, thick and heavy, drawn through him the way lungs draw air. He wasn't moving through it, it was moving through him. On the screen, one silent program ended and another began. Faces appeared, frozen in expressive gestures that never resolved into motion. Mouths opened mid-sentence and stayed that way. Conversation reduced to posture, performance without awareness. Cale watched. Blinking became difficult. His eyelids thinned, growing fragile and translucent, and he understood with a distant calm that one day soon he would stop closing them at all. He would simply look, forever awake, never present. Outside, night deepened without any hint of morning. Snow drifted down endlessly, untouched by wind or urgency. The road beyond the lot waited. So did the town. So did the house with its inviting doors and carefully designed delays, ready to welcome the next soul who believed luck was something you could recognize before it swallowed you. Cale opened his mouth again. The sound returned steady, consuming. Not loud, not violent, just absolute. The noise of time being undone, stripped of direction, reduced to waste. No heat, no force, only subtraction. He remained seated by the window in room 7 of a nameless motel, in a place with no tomorrow, inside a body that no longer belonged to him. Waiting, not with hope, not with fear, but with the calm certainty of a mechanism that understands exactly why it exists. Snow continued to fall. The screen continued to glow. And Cale, who had once wandered with empty pockets and big plans, who had believed that seizing the right moment could change everything, finally understood the truth. He had never been chasing opportunity. He had been stepping into position. A role written long before he arrived, long before the town, long before time learned how to pretend it could move forward. And now the stage was ready again.